Hello, welcome back to part 2 of an introduction to logical fallacy and propaganda, in which we are looking at 13 categories in order to make it easier for a critical thinker to spot this type of error. We were talking about slippery slope and how it's the idea that if you take one step in a negative direction, that a bunch of other negative things are going to happen and it's all going to end in doom and disaster. For example, the argument, if you don't stop smoking, the next thing you know, you're going to be shooting heroin. Now, that sounds absurd to us, doesn't it? And yet this argument of gateway drugs has been proposed before. Maybe not quite so intensely, but the idea that people who smoke recreational drugs are more likely to progress to hard drugs. And just because you say that is so doesn't make it so. That is a fallacious series of reasoning. You can take one step in a negative direction and then stop. It's not necessarily going to end in disaster. For example, if we say we can't have nuclear power plants, nuclear energy is going to end up destroying the world. That's a slippery slope argument. First of all, we can have nuclear energy without building nuclear bombs. Secondly, we can have nuclear bombs without using them. And finally, we could even use a nuclear bomb, but then stop and not destroy the world. This logical fallacy that one step is going to create a snowball effect that ends in disaster is called slippery slope. Let's talk about appeal to authority. This type of logical fallacy or propaganda technique is related to the idea of the testimonial. It's a valid type of evidence to have an expert give a testimonial in support of your point of view. However, it becomes an error when the expert you're referring to is just a famous person or is an expert in another area and not the area you're arguing about. It's one of those things where it looks really good, but on closer examination, it just doesn't cut it. For example, if we saw on Weight Watchers' website a testimonial by Oprah, who's a famous person, saying that Weight Watchers will work for everyone. Well, Oprah is famous, and she could provide evidence for a specific case study that it worked for her. But because she's not an expert in health and nutrition, it would be fallacious for her to make a statement that it would work for everyone. And I'm not saying she has, I'm just saying it would be. Instead, if Oprah made a statement in her area of expertise, which is media, that would be a valid testimonial. And we have a picture here of a famous dog saying that a dog is the healthiest dog food. That is a logical fallacy because dogs, unfortunately, we don't think they're smart enough to be able to analyze dog food and tell you which is the healthiest. They're just kind of famous, and so it's also like transfer, trying to get those good feelings you see looking at the beautiful dog to get you to buy the dog food when a dog is not actually an authority on the healthiness of dog food. Let's talk about card stacking. Card stacking comes from cheating at cards. When you have access to a deck of cards beforehand, and you put all the high-scoring cards in the deck in such an order that when the deck is still dealt, one person gets all the good cards. Well, that's cheating in cards, and card stacking is cheating in logic. It's a fallacy of omission. It's when support for only one point of view is given. There is no examination of opposing arguments, and there are no counter arguments. Or in propaganda, it's related to only providing data and statistics and testimonial in support of your product and not giving any information about the negative effects or the downside of buying a particular product. Our next type is hasty generalization. I call this jumping to a conclusion. It's a type of logical fallacy in inductive reasoning where a conclusion is made without enough evidence. Statisticians call this an insufficient N. In other words, if you're looking at 100 cases and the N, the number that prove your hypothesis, is only 3, that's insufficient evidence to make your hypothesis a valid conclusion. It all depends on how many cases support you and how many cases there are all together. And a specific example would be if 2 shark attacks happened in Florida one summer, and people decided that they wanted swimming on all public beaches to be banned. Well, 2 shark attacks, when you look at the big picture, in the thousands or millions of people who swim on Florida's beaches each year, and even the other things that cause death while people are swimming in the ocean, it's a hasty generalization to ban swimming altogether on beaches based on 2 shark attacks. The 2 shark attacks are insufficient evidence to draw a conclusion that the beaches are unusually dangerous this particular year. Our next type of logical fallacy is called begging the question. It's also known as circular reasoning, and it's basically saying something is true because it's true. What, you say? Well, you'd be surprised how often we run across this logical fallacy. For example, if someone is arguing that spinach is healthy because it's good for you, that's begging the question. Healthy and good for you are the same thing. A is true because A is true. Our visual example is if someone reads a book and they say, wow, there's really great ideas in this book. I'm sure these ideas are true. And the person's friend says, well, how do you know they're true? And the person says, well, it says here right in the book that they're true. That is begging the question. And it happens more often than you would realize. It's usually a logical fallacy. People don't realize that they're doing it. Strawman is a logical fallacy when an opponent gives the impression of having countered an argument when in fact they've misrepresented the argument and attacked the misrepresentation. So let's take, for example, someone is a politician, is saying they want to continue to allow the use of marijuana for medical purposes in their state. Their opponent says that they want to continue to allow marijuana to be legalized for recreational use. Those two things are not the same. Being legalized for medical use and being legalized for recreational use are different. But if the opponent says that they actually want to legalize recreational marijuana and start attacking that point of view, then that's an example of the strawman fallacy. And that comes from back in the day when people practiced fighting with swords and other weapons. They would build a man out of straw and attack that. So it's attacking something fake instead of attacking the real thing. Next, let's talk about appeal to emotion, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's when the arguer is appealing to the audience's emotions using biased or loaded language or images, and they're doing that instead of offering logical support. An appeal to emotion can be appealing to positive emotions, such as love for family or country. as well as negative emotions, such as fear and pity. Our visual example is actually a joke. Don't worry, no dogs were harmed. It says, if you don't buy this magazine, we'll kill this dog. Well, it's a joke. Nobody's really going to kill a dog. They are lampooning or making fun of people who appeal to emotion rather than logic to get people to make decisions. Transfer is a related propaganda technique in which an unrelated positive image is used to promote a product or idea. So what do we mean by that? Well, that's when you see an advertisement with an attractive person next to a car. We think the person is attractive, so the advertiser is hoping that we'll also be attracted to the product. Now, that's not a logical reason to buy that product. Another example I call put a kitty on it. Most people like little small furry animals. You want to sell something, put a kitty on the label. It gets people thinking positive thoughts, and they might be more likely to buy something and feel positively about it. Works with negative images as well. If you put a symbol or a picture that's violent or causes people to feel negatively, your emotions are already flowing in a negative direction before you engage your logic, and that might be manipulative. Let's look at AdHominem, which is Latin for to the man. It's when you don't attack the argument itself. Instead, you attack the arguer, the person or entity making the argument. It includes name calling. If you say someone is a nasty person, and so their argument must be false, that's AdHominem. Or if Calvin says, your face is an AdHominem, that's name calling. It's not a logical response, and it would be a logical fallacy or propaganda if you're trying to manipulate someone. Next, we should examine NonSequitur, which is when a conclusion doesn't logically follow the premise. There's a problem with one part of a deductive argument. Let's take a look at the syllogism, men are human, Mary is human, therefore Mary is a man. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, does it? Mary could be a woman. Mary could be a bird. We don't know. So why doesn't this argument work? Because the first piece has a problem. It's true that men are human, but we're going from the smaller to the larger. And when we make that kind of a general statement, it should go from the larger to the example. And here we have a puppy dog who is very confused because of a non sequitur and concludes that he must be a cat. Our next type is faulty cause and effect, and that is involving cause and effect relationships where you assume that one thing causes another without logical proof. Or post hoc, where because one thing happens and then another thing happens after it, that the first thing caused the second, even if it didn't. You should never assume that correlation is causation. Just because two things happen together or one after another, they may not be directly linked. Next, we're going to look at the either-or fallacy, which is also called the false dilemma. It's an argument that suggests that there are only two possible outcomes. For example, use D2L pulsap or be disorganized. Well, guess what? Those aren't the only two options. Other options, like using a different kind of calendar, exist. And finally, we have false metaphor. That's where you compare two ideas or items as if they're the same or equal when they're not. It's also called comparing apples to oranges.